I had spent the entire day preparing for what I thought would be a simple, pleasant evening. The aroma of roasted chicken filled the house, mingling with the delicate scent of lavender candles I had carefully placed around the dining room. Everything had to be perfect. Mark, my husband, and my sister Laura were coming over for dinner. I wanted it to feel warm, welcoming, the kind of evening that felt like home. I polished the silverware until it gleamed and laid out my grandmother's china, each plate placed just so. I even picked out a soft playlist of classical music, thinking it might soften any tensions or awkward silences. I smiled to myself, imagining Laura and Mark laughing across the table, the clinking of glasses punctuating their stories. I thought of it as a chance for family to connect, to be reminded that despite busy lives and small quarrels, we were still tied together. Mark came home earlier than usual that evening, humming a tune I didn't recognize. He kissed me on the cheek and asked if he could help, but I waved him off, insisting I had it under control. Still, I felt a flicker of unease that I tried to ignore. He had seemed distant lately, distracted by work, always checking his phone, always in a hurry. I chalked it up to stress. That's what I wanted it to be. Stress. When Laura arrived, her presence should have brought joy, but the first thing I noticed was the way she avoided my gaze. She hugged me with a little too much force, then smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Families have awkward dinners sometimes, right? We all sat down, the table glowing softly under the chandelier, the food steaming in front of us. I poured wine for everyone, raising my glass with a cheerful, "To family." Mark smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Laura clinked her glass against mine, and I forced a laugh, the tension in the air pressing on my chest. As we started eating, I tried to engage them in conversation. I asked about work, about friends, about her recent trip to the coast. Laura's responses were brief, clipped, as if she was holding something back. I noticed Mark's hand tremble slightly as he picked up his fork. Something in that small movement unsettled me. My stomach fluttered in a way I didn't like, and yet, I held on to the belief that tonight was meant to be perfect. The food was perfect, the candles perfect, the music perfect. Everything outside my little bubble seemed right. I had worked so hard to create a haven of warmth and love, a momentary escape from the ordinary. I could never have imagined that within minutes, this carefully constructed evening would shatter into pieces I couldn't even begin to imagine. Because little did I know, Laura had been carrying a secret, one that would turn this perfect dinner into the worst night of my life. The clatter of cutlery against china faded into a tense silence as Laura set down her fork. I thought she might be tired or distracted, but the look on her face told me something else entirely. Something heavier. My heart, which had been beating calmly just moments before, now thumped in my chest like a warning drum. "Can I say something?" she asked, her voice unsteady, almost fragile. I nodded, trying to smile, hoping this was just another minor confession, something trivial. But the way she avoided Mark's eyes made my stomach twist. I'm pregnant," Laura said, her voice almost a whisper. My first instinct was to feel joy for her, but the way she paused made my skin prickle. I glanced at Mark, expecting him to light up, to share in this small family excitement. Instead, he looked, frozen. And she hesitated, biting her lip. "It's not Mark's." My mind blanked. I didn't understand. Not Mark's? Then whose? The air in the room grew thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I leaned forward, trying to catch her next words before they fell like a hammer. "It's your baby," she said. Time seemed to stop. The fork in my hand felt impossibly heavy. I looked at Mark, but his face was unreadable, a mask that betrayed nothing. My chest tightened. My mind raced, and yet my voice caught in my throat. "What do you mean?" I managed to choke out. Laura swallowed hard. "I mean, I've been seeing Mark, and now I'm pregnant with his baby." The words hung in the air, electric and destructive, cutting through the warm glow of the candles, the comforting aroma of roasted chicken, the soft strains of music. Nothing felt comforting anymore. I don't remember what I said next. I must have asked questions, screamed, cried, demanded answers, but the details blurred together, a storm of confusion, betrayal, and disbelief. Mark tried to explain, to justify, to calm me, but it was impossible. His words bounced off me like pebbles against steel. I couldn't hear them. I could only feel the shock twisting my insides. The dinner I had spent hours preparing, the perfect evening I had envisioned, crumbled before my eyes. The table that had been a symbol of warmth and family now seemed alien, a stage for a revelation that I was not ready to confront. Laura sat there, quiet now, guilt written across her face, while Mark's hands trembled on the table. I remember standing abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. The sound seemed deafening. "How could you do this?" I whispered, not just to Mark, but to Laura, to the universe, to myself. "How could you betray me like this?" And in that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. Not our family, not our marriage, not the safe little world I had built in my home. The perfect dinner was over, replaced by a nightmare I couldn't escape. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The secrets, the lies, the betrayals, they would continue to unfold over the coming days, unraveling the very foundation of my life. I retreated to the guest room, my hands shaking, my chest aching. The muffled voices of Mark and Laura drifted through the walls, a low hum of arguing and guilt that I couldn't make sense of. I wanted to run, to leave everything behind, but my body refused to move. I was trapped in a haze of disbelief, my mind replaying the words over and over. "I've been seeing Mark, and now I'm pregnant with his baby." I sank onto the bed, burying my face in the pillows, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt upside down. Memories of our life together, our quiet Sunday mornings, shared laughter, and whispered dreams clashed violently with this new reality. How could the man I trusted more than anyone else betray me so completely? And why did Laura, someone I had always considered a friend, choose to destroy my marriage? After what felt like hours, I wiped my tears and forced myself to face the living room. The sight of Mark and Laura sitting side by side, talking in hushed tones, felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to storm out, but I remained rooted to the spot, powerless. The betrayal wasn't just in the act itself. It was in the casual way they sat there, almost as if they had rehearsed this moment for maximum pain. I remembered the conversations Mark and I had had just last week, plans for a vacation, discussions about our future. Were they all lies? Had every smile, every touch, been nothing more than a mask hiding his secret life? My stomach churned, a mix of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. Finally, Mark noticed me standing there, frozen and trembling. "Please," he said softly, "can we talk?" But there was no apology, no attempt to explain the choices that had shattered my world. His eyes, usually warm and familiar, seemed distant, almost foreign. And Laura. She looked at me with those same pleading eyes, but I saw only regret mixed with defiance, a complicated mess that I didn't have the strength to untangle. I left the house that night, wandering through the quiet streets, the cool air failing to soothe the storm inside me. Every step felt heavy, as if the betrayal had grown roots inside my chest. I couldn't imagine going back, couldn't imagine facing them, couldn't imagine forgiving. The next morning, I found myself making decisions I hadn't anticipated. I called my sister and told her I needed space, telling her nothing about what had happened. I began quietly researching lawyers, reading about separations and divorces, and imagining a life that didn't include Mark or the chaos that had invaded our home. And yet, despite my anger and hurt, a small, reluctant part of me still clung to hope. Hope that somehow, some way, we could emerge from this wreckage intact. But deep down, I knew the path ahead would be long and painful. The betrayal had changed everything. There would be no simple reconciliation, no instant fixes. Only time, courage, and resilience could guide me through the storm that had become my life. The days after that night were a blur. I tried to return to some sense of normalcy, but every little reminder of Mark and our home twisted the knife deeper. I avoided his calls, his texts, and even the places we used to go together. I knew I needed answers, but I also knew facing them meant stepping into a storm I wasn't sure I could survive. Finally, I summoned the courage to confront them. I chose a quiet Sunday afternoon when the house was empty enough that I could demand honesty without an audience. As I entered the living room, I saw them, Mark sitting stiffly on the couch, Laura perched at the edge of the armchair, both avoiding my gaze. "I need the truth," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Everything. No excuses, no lies." Laura swallowed hard, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. I never meant for this to happen," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow. Mark looked down, jaw tight, avoiding my eyes, as if admitting guilt would break some unspoken boundary. "Never meant for it to happen?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Laura, you're pregnant. With his baby. How is that something that just happened?" My hands were trembling now, my pulse pounding so loudly I feared they'd hear it. Mark finally spoke, his voice low and cautious. "It wasn't planned. I don't know what I was thinking. I made a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" That single word cut through me like glass. Every shared memory, every promise, every plan we had made together, all reduced to a single careless word. I wanted to shout, to cry, to collapse on the floor, but I forced myself to breathe, to stay present, to absorb their confessions without letting anger consume me entirely. Laura spoke again, more insistently this time. "I love him, and he loves me. I know it's wrong, but—" Her voice faltered, trailing off into the thick silence of the room. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. Love? Love had nothing to do with this betrayal. This was about choices, consequences, and destruction. The people I had trusted most had torn my life apart while I was still sleeping, laughing, living as if nothing had changed. I left them there, words unspoken, heart heavy. I walked outside, inhaling the crisp air, letting the sunlight burn away some of the fog clouding my mind. I realized something then. I could not control their actions, their regrets, or their love for one another. I could only control my response, my strength, my next steps. That night, I packed a small bag. Essentials for a short trip, but more importantly, essentials for reclaiming a sense of self I hadn't felt in months. I didn't know where I was going or what the future held, but I knew I had to take the first step away from the life that had been stolen from me. As I closed the door behind me, leaving Mark and Laura in the chaos they had created, a fragile sense of empowerment settled over me. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a start. For the first time since that dinner, I felt that maybe, just maybe, I could survive. I left that night with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because I no longer had to pretend, no longer had to sit at the same table with the people who had shattered my world. Dread because I had no plan, no roadmap, and no idea how to rebuild from the wreckage that had been my life for the past few months. I drove aimlessly at first, the city streets a blur under the headlights. I didn't care where I went, only that I was moving, away from them, away from the constant reminders of betrayal. Eventually, I found myself at a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town. The owner, a kind woman named Margaret, welcomed me warmly, sensing my exhaustion and need for solitude. I didn't tell her my story, just that I needed a room for a while. For the first few days, I allowed myself to simply exist. I took long walks along the nearby trails, drank tea by the window, and read novels I had neglected for years. The quiet was almost painful, but also necessary. I had been running on autopilot in my old life, always reacting to others, always trying to maintain appearances. Now, for the first time in months, I had space to think, to breathe, to feel. But the world outside that small haven did not forget me. A week into my stay, I received a message that made my stomach drop. A news alert about Mark and Laura. Their home had burned down in a mysterious fire. No one was hurt, thankfully, but everything they owned, everything they had built, was gone. I felt an odd mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to feel that karma had delivered its own punishment. But another part of me recoiled. Disaster of that scale changes people. It doesn't erase betrayal, it magnifies it. I couldn't allow myself to be distracted by their misfortune, not yet. I had my own life to reclaim. Still, I couldn't ignore it entirely. Curiosity and unresolved anger pulled me into the news coverage. I read about the fire again and again, scrutinizing every detail, every report, every rumor. Each word was a reminder that my life had been intertwined with theirs in ways I could never untangle. At night, I lay awake, wondering what I had left behind. My old apartment felt empty in my mind, even as I imagined returning. My friends had distanced themselves, uncertain how to approach me, afraid of the drama that had unfolded. I was alone, truly alone, but that solitude was both terrifying and liberating. By the end of the week, I realized something important. I had survived the worst betrayal a person could endure, and I was still standing. That, in itself, was a kind of victory. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether Mark and Laura would continue to haunt my thoughts, but for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. I decided to stay at the bed and breakfast a little longer, not as a hiding place, but as a sanctuary, a place to gather strength before stepping back into a world that had tried to break me. The fire, the betrayal, the lies, they were all behind me now, or at least I hoped they were. The days at the bed and breakfast passed slowly, each one blending into the next. I busied myself with long walks, journaling, and quiet moments by the window. Yet no matter how far I ran, the echoes of the past found me. Even in this peaceful little town, the memory of betrayal lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. One morning, while reading the local newspaper over breakfast, I froze. There, in the small print, was a story about Mark and Laura's misfortune. The fire had been determined to be accidental, but the article hinted at suspicions, neighbors whispering, insurance investigators poking around. My chest tightened. Despite everything, a part of me worried. After all, accidents could spiral into more chaos, and I couldn't shake the feeling that their recklessness might somehow draw me back into the storm. Later that day, I went for a long walk to clear my mind. The forested trails were peaceful, the sunlight filtering through leaves, birds singing in distant trees. I tried to breathe in the calm, but my mind wandered to the dinner table, the moment when Mark had announced Laura's pregnancy with his child. The memory made my stomach turn. That night had set off a chain reaction of heartbreak and confusion I wasn't sure I would ever fully escape. As I walked, I thought about the future. I had been given a second chance, even if it was forced upon me by circumstances I never could have predicted. I needed to reclaim my sense of self, to rebuild my life without the shadows of Mark and Laura hanging over it. But how do you rebuild when betrayal has left you questioning everything, even your own judgment? That evening, I received a call from my best friend, Sophie. She had been silent for weeks, hesitant to reach out, unsure of how to approach the shattered woman she knew. But hearing her voice now was like a lifeline. She didn't ask for details immediately. She simply listened as I spoke, letting me spill my emotions without interruption. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of relief, not from the situation itself, but from the knowledge that I wasn't entirely alone. Sophie suggested something that surprised me. "Why don't you come stay with me for a while? Get out of that town, start fresh somewhere new. You don't have to decide anything yet, but maybe a change of scenery will help you think clearly." Her words sparked an unfamiliar excitement. A new place, new people, new opportunities, away from the reminders of betrayal, away from Mark and Laura. Perhaps it was time to step out of hiding and confront the world on my own terms. That night, I packed a small bag, feeling the weight of the past still clinging to me, but also a faint sense of anticipation. I didn't know what awaited me at Sophie's, or what challenges lay ahead, but I realized I was no longer the same woman who had walked into that dinner months ago. I was stronger, wiser, and determined to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me. As I drifted to sleep that night, I allowed myself one thought. Maybe the worst was behind me. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally take the first steps toward happiness again. The morning air at Sophie's house was crisp and filled with the scent of blooming flowers. I poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety that had been my constant companion since that disastrous dinner months ago. Life had slowed down. The world outside Sophie's small town felt calmer, almost gentle, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. Just as I was settling into the routine of a quiet morning, a letter arrived in the mailbox. Its envelope was plain, the handwriting familiar, and instantly, my heart sank. I hadn't seen Mark's handwriting in weeks, not since I'd fled that toxic situation, and yet here it was, as if fate itself were forcing me to confront him again. I hesitated, staring at the envelope like it might somehow vanish if I ignored it. But the pull was too strong. With trembling hands, I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, carefully written. Mark's words were measured, almost painfully so, acknowledging the fire, the pregnancy, the chaos. He wrote about regret and loss, about how he and Laura had lost everything and were now left to face the consequences of their reckless decisions. Reading the letter, my emotions twisted in on themselves. Part of me felt vindicated. They had indeed lost everything, but another part of me was reminded of the pain they had caused. I tried to tell myself that I no longer cared, that I was moving on, but Mark's words carried an insidious power. He was apologizing, yes, but there was a subtle attempt to pull me back into the drama, to reopen the wounds I had worked so hard to close. I shoved the letter onto the kitchen counter, pacing. Sophie, noticing my agitation, poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from me. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently. I shook my head, unable to meet her eyes. How could I explain the whirlwind of relief, anger, and confusion that the letter stirred inside me? Instead, I focused on the only thing I could control, myself. I reminded myself that this letter didn't define me. Mark and Laura's failures were theirs alone. I had survived, and I had built a small sanctuary here. I wasn't going to allow their past mistakes to drag me back into a world I had fought so hard to leave. But even as I tried to push the letter from my mind, a strange curiosity gnawed at me. What exactly had they lost? How had their lives crumbled so completely? I knew that knowledge could hurt me, or it could satisfy some dark part of my need for closure. I debated for hours, pacing Sophie's living room, sipping tea, and glancing at the envelope like a tether to a world I wanted to forget. Finally, I made a decision. I would read the letter again, but this time with purpose, not to dwell, not to let anger fester, but to understand and finally close the chapter. I needed to see the truth of their downfall, the reality of their recklessness, before I could fully step into a future where I could breathe freely. As I unfolded the letter once more, I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. One thing was certain: whatever lay inside, it would mark a turning point. For me, for them, and for the fragile sense of freedom I had begun to rebuild. That afternoon, after reading Mark's letter again, I decided it was time to confront the reality of what had happened. Not him, not Laura, not even the chaos they had caused, but the truth that had been sitting, heavy and silent, in the corners of my life. I needed clarity, and perhaps more than anything, I needed closure. I drove into town, letting the wind whip through the car windows, feeling the small sense of liberation that came with distance. Sophie rode with me, silent but supportive, her presence like a soft anchor as I navigated the storm inside my own mind. I didn't want revenge, not really. I wanted understanding. I wanted to see the consequences of their recklessness laid bare, so I could finally let it go. When I arrived at the house where Mark and Laura had been living, it was almost unrecognizable. The once immaculate garden was overgrown, the windows dusty, and the paint peeling in stubborn strips. A for sale sign leaned crookedly against the lawn. It was a visual confirmation of the chaos they had left behind, a tangible representation of their downfall. My chest tightened, not with satisfaction, but with a strange mixture of sadness and disbelief. I knocked on the door, unsure what I expected. An apology? A confrontation? Perhaps nothing at all. When no one answered, I peeked through the curtain and saw emptiness, silence, and abandonment. Their lives, once so intertwined with mine, now lay in ruins. I felt a curious sense of release. No words, no explanations, no confrontations were necessary. The consequences had spoken for themselves. Driving back, Sophie reached over and squeezed my hand. "It's over," she said simply. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that closure wasn't just about seeing them fall. It was about reclaiming myself, my life, my peace. I realized that for months I had carried the weight of their decisions, of Mark's betrayal, as if it were mine to bear. But it wasn't. Their loss was theirs alone. That night, back at Sophie's, I sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea. I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't in a long time: calm. Not happiness, not joy, but a quiet, steady understanding that life, in all its messiness, would continue. And I had survived. I had grown stronger. I had reclaimed the part of me that they had tried to destroy. I knew there would be more moments of doubt, more letters, more reminders of the chaos they had sown, but for the first time, I felt capable of facing them without fear. I had my own story to write now, one not dictated by betrayal or loss, but by resilience and self-respect. That night, as the wind rustled the trees outside, I allowed myself to imagine the future, not the one they had tried to trap me in, but my own. It was a future built slowly, patiently, and honestly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to embrace it. The morning after my visit to their abandoned home, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The heaviness that had followed me for so long was lifting, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild not just my life, but the version of myself that had been buried under betrayal and heartbreak. I started small. The garden outside my little apartment had been neglected, overrun with weeds and fallen leaves, much like the neglected corners of my own life. I spent the morning pulling out the overgrowth, planting bright flowers, and sweeping away the remnants of neglect. Each action, no matter how simple, felt symbolic, a reclamation of control, a way to nurture something alive and beautiful in a world that had seemed so cruel. Sophie stopped by that afternoon, bringing with her her usual warmth and a basket of fresh pastries. We sat in the sun, laughing over memories that weren't tainted by betrayal, simple stories from childhood, shared dreams, and quiet reflections on life. It was the first time in what felt like forever that I laughed freely, without a shadow lurking behind my joy. As days turned into weeks, I began to take steps toward independence I had once thought impossible. I joined a book club at the local library, not just for the love of reading, but for the company of people who were kind, steady, and genuinely interested in conversation. I enrolled in a painting class, letting colors spill across the canvas in ways that mirrored the freedom I was slowly feeling inside. At night, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the soft hum of the city and letting myself reflect. Mark and Laura were no longer the center of my thoughts. Their choices, their betrayals, had played their part, but now it was time for me to step fully into my own story. The weight that had once seemed unbearable now felt like a distant memory, a lesson learned rather than a wound still open. And then came the day when I realized something profound. I was truly happy again. Not in fleeting moments or hollow distractions, but deep down, in the steady rhythm of my life. The freedom I had longed for, the ability to wake up without dread, to trust in myself again, was finally mine. I called my closest friends and family, sharing my newfound sense of peace. Their joy for me was genuine, their support unwavering. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, not for the chaos I had survived, but for the strength I had discovered within myself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I sat on my porch and breathed deeply. The past was behind me. The future was mine to shape. And for the first time, I knew that happiness wasn't something to chase. It was something to build, brick by brick, moment by moment, with patience, courage, and an open heart. I smiled, knowing that life would continue to surprise me, challenge me, and sometimes even break me. But I was ready. I was strong. I was whole. And that, more than anything, was victory. The morning air felt crisp as I stepped outside, carrying a sense of calm that had been foreign to me for so long. It was a Saturday, but I wasn't rushing anywhere. There was no pressure, no expectations, just a quiet opportunity to exist fully in my own life. I had rebuilt so much already: my home, my routines, my friendships, and most importantly, my sense of self. I decided to take a walk through the park, letting the familiar paths guide me. Children ran past on bicycles, laughter echoing across the green fields, while elderly couples strolled hand in hand, comfortable in the years they had spent together. I paused on a bench and watched, feeling a deep, quiet contentment. I wasn't looking for love or validation anymore. I was finally free to simply live and to savor every moment. My phone buzzed with messages from Sophie and a few new friends I had made in the past months. Invitations to coffee, book discussions, and even a small art exhibit I had been too shy to attend before. I smiled, realizing how rich my life had become, filled with people who truly cared about me, not because of drama or scandal, but because of who I was. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner for myself and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. There was a quiet satisfaction in being alone and yet not lonely. I poured a glass of wine and toasted quietly to the journey I had survived. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the confusion. All of it had shaped me, yes, but none of it defined me. Later that night, as I folded laundry, I paused to look at a photo of myself taken on a happier day, long before the chaos began. The woman in that picture looked innocent, trusting, and maybe even naive. But now, in the reflection of the mirror, I saw someone wiser, stronger, and more resilient than I had ever imagined. I traced my fingers over the edges of the photo, smiling softly. She had survived, she had learned, and she had grown. A knock at the door startled me, and I opened it to find Sophie standing there, holding a small bouquet of flowers. "I thought these might brighten your evening," she said, handing them to me with a warm smile. We sat together in the living room, sharing stories, laughing, and talking about plans for the future. There was no drama, no lingering shadows from the past, just a comforting sense of connection and love. As the night deepened, I felt a sense of closure I had once thought impossible. Mark and Laura, with their betrayals and losses, were no longer part of my story, except as reminders of how far I had come. I had reclaimed my life, my peace, and my joy. I went to bed that night feeling a deep gratitude I hadn't known in years. Gratitude for survival, for friendship, and for the chance to start anew. For the first time, I believed in a future full of hope, laughter, and unexpected joys. And as sleep claimed me, I whispered to myself, "This is my life. My heart is whole, and the best is yet to come."